Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? It's another day for the Funky Bunch of Sunday Brunch Podcast. And we're here to give you some more knowledge on video game genres and subgenres. How are we all doing? Are we excited to just get some more knowledge going? I hope you are, because I am as well. We took a week off last week, and now we're going to just jump right back in as if we missed no time at all. So, for a refresher, we were finishing up the adventure genre, and an adventure game is one of the earliest games created, beginning with that text adventure Colossal Cave adventure in the 1970s. Unlike adventure films, adventure games are not defined by story or content. Rather, adventure describes a manner of gameplay without reflex challenges or action. They normally require the player to solve various puzzles by interacting with people or the environment, most often in a non-confrontational way. It is considered a purist genre and tends to exclude anything, which includes action elements beyond a mini-game. Some of the subgenres that we were going over that were, that are considered pure would be text adventures, graphic adventures, interactive movies, real-time 3D adventures, interactive fiction. I think there might have been one or two others. And the last one that we hadn't touched yet, and we're going to do right now, is the visual novel game. So, a visual novel, often abbreviated as VN, is an interactive fiction video game genre featuring text-based story with narrative style of literature and interactivity aided by static or sprite-based visuals, most often using anime-style art or occasionally live-action stills and sometimes video footage. As the name suggests, they resemble mixed media novels. Visual novels originated in and are especially prevalent in Japan, where they made up nearly 70% of the PC game titles released in 2006. In Japanese, a distinction is made between visual novels, NVL, or from novel, which consists primarily of narration and have very few interactive elements, and adventure games, or AVG or ADV, which incorporate problem solving and other types of gameplay. This distinction is normally lost outside Japan, where both visual novels and adventure games are commonly referred to as visual novels by international fans. So basically, the Japanese completely separate the visual novels into two separate categories. Interesting. Visual novels are rarely produced for video game consoles, but the more popular games have occasionally been ported to systems such as the Sega Saturn, Dreamcast, PSP, or Xbox 360. The more famous visual novels are also often adapted into light novels, manga, or anime. The market for visual novels outside of East Asia is small, though a number of anime based on visual novels are popular among anime fans in the Western world. Examples include Clanad, Steins Gate, and Fate/Stay Night. So, gameplay. Visual novels are distinguished from other game types by their generally minimal gameplay. Typically, the majority of player interaction is limited to clicking to keep the text, graphics, and sound moving. Many recent games offer play or fast-forward toggles that make this unnecessary, while making narrative choices along the way. Another main characteristic of visual novels are its strong emphasis on the prose, as the narration in visual novels are delivered through text. This characteristic makes playing visual novels similar to reading a book. Most visual novels have multiple storylines and more than one ending. The mechanics in these cases typically consist of intermittent multiple-choice decision points, where the player selects a direction in which to take the game. For example, In a dating simulator themed visual novel, the player is prompted to pick different girls to date, which in turn leads to a different ending. This style of gameplay is similar to story-driven interactive fiction or the shorter and less detailed real-life game books. Many fans of visual novels hold them up as exceptions to the relatively weak storytelling in video games overall. Some visual novels do not limit themselves to merely interactive fiction, but also incorporate other elements into them. An example of this approach is Symphonic Rain, where the player is required to play a musical instrument of some sort and attain a good score in order to advance. Usually, such an element is related as a plot device in the game. Fan-created visual novels are reasonably popular. There are a number of free game engines and construction kits aimed at making them easy to construct, most notably Nscriptor, Kiri, and Renpai. Many visual novels use voice actors to provide voices for the characters in the game. Often, the protagonist is left unvoiced, even when the rest of the characters are fully voiced. This choice is meant to aid the player in identifying with the protagonist and to avoid having to record large amounts of dialogue. So the main character typically has the most speaking lines due to the branching nature of visual novels. So jumping into the branching narratives, non-linear branching storylines are a common trend in visual novels, which frequently use multiple branching storylines to achieve multiple different endings, allowing non-linear freedom of choice along the way. Similar to a choose your own adventure novel. Decision points within a visual novel often present players with the option of altering the course of events during the game, leading to many different possible outcomes. An acclaimed example is Zero Escape, Virtue's Last Reward, where nearly every action and dialogue choice can lead to an entirely new branching path and ending. Each path only reveals certain aspects of the overall storyline, and it is only after uncovering all the possible different paths and outcomes through multiple playthroughs that every component comes together to form a coherent, well-written story. That's kind of interesting to me. It's like you've got a game, you're creating that game, that world, but you hide most of that world behind different areas of the game that you have to somehow experience first before you even get a chance to really, figure out what it is. You got to keep playing and playing and playing to understand what's going on. The digital medium in visual novels allow for significant improvements, such as being able to fully explore multiple aspects and perspectives of a story. Another improvement is having hidden decision points that are automatically determined based on the player's past decisions. In Fate/Stay Night, for example, the way the player character behaved towards NPCs during the course of the game affects the way they react to the player character in later scenes, such as whether or not they choose to help in life or death situations. This would be far more difficult to track with physical books. More importantly, visual novels do not face the same length restrictions as a physical book. For example, the total word count of the English fan translation of Fate/Stay Night, taking all branching paths into account, exceeds that of the Lord of the Rings by almost 80%. So is that the Lord of the Rings first novel? All three novels? All three novels plus The Hobbit? All three novels plus The Hobbit plus the Elven Dictionary? Because that's all Lord of the Rings. This significant increase in length allows visual novels to tell stories as long and complex as those often found in traditional novels, while still maintaining a branching path structure, allowing them to focus on complex stories with mature themes and consistent plots in a way which choose your own adventure books were unable to do due to their physical limitations. Visual novels with non-branching plots such as Higurashi When They Cry, Planetarium, The Revere on a Little Planet, Mauve Love Alternative, and Digital, a Love Story, are rare exceptions within the genre and are known as kinetic novels. Many visual novels often revolve almost entirely around character interactions and dialogue choices, usually featuring complex branching dialogues and often presenting the player's possible responses word for word as the player character would say them. Such titles revolving around relationship building, including visual novels as well as dating simulation, such as Tokimeki Memorial, and some role-playing games such as Shin Megami Tensei Persona, often give choices that have a different number of associated mood points that influence a player character's relationship and future conversations with NPCs. Why would they include an RPG in talking about branching narratives in a visual novel? Like, that doesn't really make sense, but whatever. These games often feature a day-night cycle with a time scheduling system that provides context and relevance to character interactions, allowing players to choose when and if to interact with certain characters, which in turn influences their responses during later conversations. It is not uncommon for visual novels to have morality systems. A well-known example is the 2005 title School Days, an animated visual novel that Kotaku describes as going well beyond the usual black and white choice systems, where you must pick a side and stick with it, while leaving the expansive middle area between unexplored. School Days instead encourages players to explore that gray, neutral middle ground in order to view the more interesting bad endings, i.e. an ending where a character dies or the main protagonist does not advance towards the flow of the story. And of course, there are RPG hybrids. So there are role-playing video games that feature visual novel style elements. A well-known example in the West is The Lost Odyssey, an RPG that features a series of visual novel-style flashback sequences called 1,000 Years of Dreams. These sequences were penned by an award-winning Japanese short story writer, Kiyoshi Shigematsu. Another title is the Arc System Works fighting game series Blaze Blue, which plays off a complex fantasy setting where a 100-year period is reset indefinitely with many variables. The many branching storylines in story mode can serve as a standalone series, but most players consider them together along with arcade mode stories to be able to fully understand the universe. Another successful example is Sega's Sakura Wars series, which combined tactical role-playing game combat with visual novel elements, introducing a real-time branching choice system where, during an event or conversation, the player must choose an action or dialogue choice within a time limit, or to not respond at all within that time. The player's choice, or lack thereof, affects the player character's relationship with other characters, and in turn, the character's performance in battle, the direction of the storyline, and the ending. Later games in the series added several variations, including an action gauge that can be raised up or down depending on the situation, and a gauge that the player can manipulate using the analog stick during the situation. The success of Sakura Wars led to a wave of games that combined role-playing and visual novel elements, including Thousand Arms, Riviera, The Promised Land, and Luminous Arc. And now the style. Despite using the narrative style of literature, visual novels have evolved a style somewhat different from print novels. In general, visual novels are more likely to be narrated in the first person than the third, and typically present events from the point of view of only one character. In the typical visual novel, the graphics comprise a set of generic backgrounds, normally just one for each location in the game, with character sprites superimposed onto these. The perspective is usually first person, with the protagonist remaining unseen. At certain key moments in the plot, special event CG computer graphics are displayed instead. These are more detailed images drawn specifically for that scene rather than being comprised from predefined elements, which often use more cinematic camera angles and include the protagonist. These event CGs can usually be viewed at any time once they have been unlocked by finding them in-game. This provides a motivation to replay the game and try making different decisions, as it is normally impossible to view all special events on a single playthrough. Like when we played Doki Doki Literature Club, we missed a good chunk of CG and just all those special scenes and stuff. We just missed them because obviously, well, you can only take one path, but yeah. Up until the 1990s, the majority of visual novels utilized pixel art. This was particularly common on the NEC PC 9801 format, which showcased what is considered to be some of the best pixel art in the history of video games, with a popular example being Police Knots in 1994. There have also been visual novels that use live-action stills or video footage, such as several sound novel games by Chunsoft. The most successful example is Machi, one of the most celebrated games in Japan, where it was voted number 5 in a 2006 Famitsu Reader poll of top 100 games of all time. The game resembled a live-action television drama, but allowing the players to explore multiple character perspectives and affect the outcome. Another successful example is 428 Shibuya Scramble, which received a perfect score of 40 out of 40 from Famitsu magazine. Excuse me. Okay, so the content and genre. Let's look at the history first. The history of visual novels dates back to Portopia Serial Murder Case, 1983. It featured non-linear elements, which include traveling between different areas in a generally open world. A branching dialogue conversation system where the story develops through entering commands and receiving responses from other characters, and making choices that determine the dialogues in order of events as well as alternative outcomes. Though there is only one true culprit, while the others are red herrings. It also features a phone that could be used to dial any number to contact several NPCs. The game was well received in Japan for its well-told storyline and surprise twist ending, and for allowing multiple ways to achieve objectives. Another more non-linear early example was Mirrors, released by Soft Studio Wing for the PC 8801 and FM Towns computers in 1990. It featured a branching narrative, multiple endings, and audio CD music. A common feature used in visual novels is having multiple protagonists giving different perspectives of the story. Eve Burst Error, 1995, developed by Hiroyuki Kano and Seizeware, introduced a unique twist to the system by allowing the player to switch between both protagonists at any time during the game, instead of finishing one protagonist scenario before playing the other. Eve Burst Error often requires the player to have both protagonists cooperate with each other at various points during the game, with choices in one scenario affecting the other. An important milestone in the history of visual novels was You Know, A Girl Who Chants Love at the Bound of This World, 1996, which was developed by Hiroyuki Kano and is Elf's most famous visual novel. It featured non-linear storytelling with a sci-fi plot revolving around time travel and parallel universes. The player travels between parallel worlds using a reflector device, which employs a limited number of stones to mark a certain position as a returning point, so that if the player decides to retrace their steps, they can go to an alternate universe to the time they have used a reflector stone. The game also implemented an original system called Automatic Diverge Mapping System, or ADAMS, which displays a screen that the player can check at any time to see the direction in which they are heading along the branching plot lines. It also featured an early isekai story arc. Revolutionized the visual novel industry, particularly with the Adams system. Audience soon began demanding large-scope plot lines and musical scores of similar quality and ambition to that of and that responded by hiring talent. According to Gamasutra, the genre became an all-new arena for young artists and musicians once again. With companies willing to take chances with fresh blood, the market thrived with the excitement and the risks that were being taken and became a hotbed of creativity. The branching timeline system was influential, opening the door for visual novels to become more elaborate and having a greater range of narrative arcs without requiring the player to replay the game over and over. According to Nintendo Life, the modern visual novel genre would simply not exist without Branching timeline systems similar to also later appeared in role-playing video games such as Radiant Historia and the PSP version of Tactics Ogre, both in 2010. Chunsoft sound novels such as Machi and 428 Shibuya Scramble developed the multiple perspective concept further. They allow the player to alternate between the perspectives of several or more characters, making choices with one character that have consequences for the others. 428 in particular features up to 85 different possible endings. Another popular visual novel featuring multiple perspectives is Fate/Stay Night 2004. So, content and genre. Most visual novels are centered around drama, particularly themes involving romance or family. But visual novels centered on sci-fi, fantasy fiction, and horror fiction are also not uncommon. Next is the Dojinshi Games, or the Dojin Soft. Dojinshi is the Japanese term for self-published or fan-made works. This includes, but is not limited to, Dojin Games, also referred to as Dojin Soft. These visual novel-style games are created as fan-made works based on pre-existing fandoms, usually anime and manga, but also for TV shows or other pre-existing games and visual novels. Dojinshi games are often based on romance or shipping between two characters, known as otome game or dating sim, sometimes becoming sexual or hentai, known as eroge, which is a portmanteau of erotic game. There's erotic content. Many visual novels also qualify as eroge, an abbreviation of erotic game. These games feature sexually explicit imagery that is accessed by completing certain routes in the game, most often depicting the game's protagonist having sex with one of the game's other characters. Like other pornographic media in Japan, scenes depicting genitalia are censored in their original Japanese release, only becoming uncensored if the game is licensed outside of Japan. Certain eroge titles receive re-releases which exclude explicit content in order to be sold to younger audiences, such as ports to consoles or handheld systems where sexually explicit content is not allowed. And storylines featuring the aforementioned sex scenes are often omitted from adaptations in other media, unless that media is pornographic in nature, such as a hentai anime. Traditionally, PC-based visual novels have contained risque scenes, even if the focus is not erotic, similar to the obligatory sex scene in Hollywood action films. However, the vast majority of console ports do not contain adult material, and a number of recent PC games have also been targeted at the all-age market. For example, all the Keys titles come in family-friendly versions, although the content might not be appropriate for children. and 3 have never contained adult content at all. Also, all of kids' titles are family friendly. However, some of these games are later re-released with the addition of erotic scenes or have a sequel with such. For example, Little Busters was first released as an all-ages visual novel, but a version with erotic scenes titled Little Busters Ecstasy came out later. And though Clanad is also all ages, its spin-off Tomoyo After It's a Wonderful Life is not. Often the beginning of eroge will be dedicated to introducing the characters and developing the protagonist's relationships with them before the protagonist sexually interacts with other characters, for example. Lump of Sugar games such as Tayutama, Kiss on My Deity, and Everlasting Summer do this. The effect it has on the reader is the H scenes, the sex scenes, will have a stronger emotional impact for the 2 or possibly more characters. Some of Japan's earliest adventure games were erotic bisouju games developed by Koei. In 1982, they released Nightlife, the first commercial erotic computer game. It was a graphic adventure with sexually explicit images. That same year, they released another erotic title, Danshi Suma no Yuwaku, Seduction of the Condominium Wife, which was an early adventure game with colored graphics. Owing to the 8-color palette on the NEC PC 8001 computer, it became a hit, helping Koei become a major software company. Other now famous companies such as Enix, Square, and Nihon Falcom also produced similar erotic games in the early 1980s before they became famous for their role-playing video games. While some early erotic games meaningfully integrate the erotic content with a thoughtful and mature storyline, others often use it as a flimsy excuse for pornography. The Japanese game Pai Touch involves the protagonist gaining the ability to change the size of the girl's breasts, and the adventures that ensue in trying to choose which girls to use the power on the most. Another subgenre is nukaige, in which sexual gratification of the player is the main focus of the game. Science fiction. In 1986, Square released the science fiction adventure game Suisho no Dragon for the NES console. The game features several innovations, including the use of animation in many of the scenes rather than still images, and an interface resembling that of a point-and-click interface for a console, like Portopia Serial Murder Case, but making use of visual icons rather than text-based ones to represent various actions. Like the NES version of Portopia Serial Murder Case, it contained a cursor that could be moved around the screen using the D-pad to examine the scenery, though the cursor in Suisho no Dragon was used to click on the action items. Hideo Kojima, the Metal Gear creator, was inspired by Portopia Serial Murder Case to enter the video game industry, and later produced his own adventure games. After completing the stealth game Metal Gear, his first graphic adventure was released by Konami the following year, Snatcher, 1988, an ambitious cyberpunk detective novel, graphic adventure that was highly regarded at the time for pushing the boundaries of video game storytelling, cinematic cutscenes, and mature content. It also featured a post-apocalyptic science fiction setting, an amnesiac protagonist, and some light gun shooter segments. It is praised for its graphics, soundtrack, high-quality writing comparable to a novel, voice acting comparable to a film or radio drama, and in-game computer days with optional documents that flesh out the game world. The Sega CD version of Snatcher was for a long time the only major visual novel game to be released in America, where it, despite low sales, gained a cult following. I've never heard of Snatcher. Following Metal Gear 2, Solid Snake, Kojima produced his next graphic adventure, Policenauts, 1994. A point-and-click adventure notable for being an early example of extensive voice recording in video games. It also featured a hard science fiction setting, a theme revolving around space exploration, a plot inspired by the ancient Japanese tale of Urashima Taro, and some occasional FMV cutscenes. The gameplay was largely similar to Snatcher, but with the addition of a point-and-click interface and some first-person shooter segments. Policenauts also introduced summary screens, which act to refresh the player's memory of the plot upon reloading a saved game, an element Kojima would later use in Metal Gear Solid. The PlayStation version of Policenauts could also read the memory card and give some Easter egg dialogues if a save file of Konami's dating sim Tokimeki Memorial is present, a technique Kojima would also later use in Metal Gear Solid. From 97 to 99, Kojima developed the 3 Tokimeki Memorial drama series titles, which were adaptations of Tokimeki Memorial in a visual novel adventure game format. Other acclaimed examples of sci-fi visual novels include Elf's Uno and 5PB's Chaos Head and Steins Gate. Naikiji. A popular subgenre of visual novels is Naikiji, which, as opposed to Utsuji, which is Naikiji is a crying game, while Utsuji is the depressing game, but the Naikiji still usually has a happy ending. The genre was largely pioneered by Key Studios co-founder, scenario writer, lyricist, and composer Jun Maeda. The main purpose of such a game is to make the player feel for the characters and make them cry because of the emotional scenarios, which serve to have a bigger impact on the player after the game is over. These games often follow a similar format, a comedic first half with a heartwarming romance middle followed by a tragic separation and finally, though not always, an emotional reunion. This formula was introduced primarily by Hiroyuki Kano's Uno, A Girl Who Chants Love at the Bound of This World, and Leaf's Two Heart, and was further developed in 1 Kagayaku Kisetsu E by Tactics. After 1 was complete, the development team quit Tactics to form Key, where they developed the first title, Canon, also based upon this formula. According to Satoshi Tadome, in his book A History of Adult Games, Kanon was heavily hyped and had gamers impatient until its release. There's only 1 game released by Key so far, and yet it had already sent major shockwaves around the industry. And yet another game, Air, 2 years later, sent even more shockwaves. Air was equally hyped and well received. Key's crying game formula, used successfully in 1 and Canon, was later adapted by other visual companies to create their own crying games. Examples of this include Kana, Little Sister, by Digital Object, The Memories Off series, 1999 onwards, by Kid, DC Da Capo by Circus, Wind, A Breath of Heart by Minori, and Snow by Studio Maibis. One of the most acclaimed visual novels of this subgenre was Key's Clanad, written by Jun Maeda, Yuichi Suzumoto, and Kai Toya Okano. Released in 2004, its story revolved around its central theme of the value of having a family. It was voted the best Bisoju game of all time in a poll held by Denki magazine. Served as the basis for a media franchise, with successful adaptations into light novel, manga, animated film, and acclaimed anime series. In 2008, several of Key's visual novels were voted in the Denki poll of the 10 most tear-inducing games of all time. Clanad at number 2, Canon at number 4, Air at number 7, and Little Busters at number 10. In 2011, several visual novels were also voted in Famitsu's poll of 20 most tear-inducing games of all time, with Clanad at number 4, Steins Gate at 6, Air at 7, Little Busters at 10, and 428 Shibuya Scramble at number 14. And finally, the last genre we're looking at within the visual novel is horror. Higurashi no Nakukoro no When They Cry was a 2002 horror-themed visual novel by Seventh Expansion, influenced by the crying game subgenre. Ryukishi 7 of Seventh Expanse mentioned in 2004 how he was influenced by Key's works and Tsukihime during the planning of Higurashi no Naku Koro ni. He played their games as well as other visual novels as a reference and analyzed them to try to determine why they were so popular. He decided that the secret was that the stories would start with ordinary, enjoyable days, but then a sudden event would occur, leading the player to cry from shock. He used a similar model as the basis for Higurashi, but instead of leading the player to cry, Ryukishi wanted to scare the player with the addition of horror elements. Other examples of horror-themed visual novels include Animamundi Dark Alchemist, Haganbana no Sakuyoru ni, Umineko no Nakukoro ni, Ukami Koshi, Imbi Imabikisho, Saya no Uta, Doki Doki Literature Club, and Corpse Party. I am struggling with these names right now. Let's see. Okay. And the last thing we'll do is the list of best-selling visual novels. Sales numbers are frequently unavailable for visual novels, and some of these might be over a decade old and not representative of their current popularity. So, free visual novels do not figure into these lists due to unreliability. So, here's a list of visual novels that have sold over 100,000 copies. With this first game having 20 million sold copies. I'm not going to read the rest of them as we go down. But, yeah. So, the one with 20 million, it goes 20 million, 17 million, and then 7 million. So, 20 million is the JB Harold Murder Club. The 17 million is Professor Layton. And then the 7 million is Ace Attorney. And now I'm going to just list the rest of them. Sakura Wars, Tokimeki Memorial, Danganronpa, Nekopara, Sound Novel, Tante Genguji Saburo, Fate, Sakura, Steins Gate, Rancy, Higurashi When They Cry, Shinseiki Evangelion, or Neon Genesis Evangelion, Tokiyusei, Zero Escape, The Death Trap, Two Heart, Eve, Clanad, Welcome to Paya Carrot, Hatoful Boyfriend, Kidoyu Senken Nadesiko, Card Captor Sakura, Muv-Love, Dies Irai. So, and then there's standalone visual novels that have sold over 100,000 copies. I actually own one of these. Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken, VA11 Hall A, Nonomura Byorin no Hitobito, a girl who chants love at the bound of this world. Long live the Queen. Police Knots, Cannon, Air, Hotel Dusk, Room 215, Monster Prom, Can Bunny, Premiere, Dokoku Soshite, and Desire. I own Long Live the Queen. And that was that. Holy crap. That was a lot. There's no way we're going to finish this in 18 minutes. But my God, are we going to get started? Oh, God. That was a lot. Just you wait. We're starting the role-playing genre. Because we just had finished Adventure. So we're moving to the next big genre. Oh boy. So, the role-playing video game. A role-playing video game, commonly referred to as simply role-playing game or RPG, as well as computer role-playing game or CRPG, is a video game genre where the player controls the actions of a character and or several party members immersed in some well-defined world, usually involving some form of character development by way of recording statics. Many role-playing video games have origins in tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons, and use much of the same terminology, setting, and game mechanics. Other major similarities with pen and paper games include developed storytelling and narrative elements, player character development, complexity, as well as the replay value and immersion. The electronic medium removes the necessity for a game master and increases combat resolution speed. RPGs have evolved from simple text-based console window games into visually rich 3D environments. So, characteristics. Role-playing video games use much of the same terminology, settings, and game mechanics as early tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons. Players control a central game character or multiple game characters, usually called a party, and attain a victory by completing a series of quests or reaching the conclusion of a central storyline. Players explore a game world while solving puzzles and engaging in combat. A key feature of the genre is that characters grow in power and abilities. Characters are typically designed by the player. RPGs rarely challenge a player's physical coordination or reaction time, with the expectations of action role-playing games. Role-playing video games typically rely on a highly developed story and setting, which is divided into a number of quests. Players control one or several characters by issuing commands, which are performed by the character at an effectiveness determined by that character's numeric attributes. Often these attributes increase each time a character gains a level. The character's level goes up each time the player accumulates a certain amount of experience. Role-playing video games are typically attempt to offer more complex and dynamic character interaction than what is found in other video game genres. It usually involves additional focus on the artificial intelligence and scripted behavior of computer-controlled NPCs. So the story and setting, the premise of many role-playing game tasks the player with saving the world, or whichever level of society is threatened. There are often twists and turns as the story progresses, such as the surprise appearance of estranged relatives, or enemies who become friends, or vice versa. The game world is often a speculative fiction, i.e. fantasy or sci-fi one, which allows players to do things they cannot do in real life, and helps players suspend their disbelief about the rapid character growth. To a lesser extent, settings closer to the present day or near future are possible. The story provides much of the entertainment in the game. Because these games have strong storylines, they can often make effective use of recorded dialogue and voiceover narration. Players of these games tend to appreciate long cutscenes more than players of faster action games. While most games advance the plot when the player defeats an enemy or completes a level, role-playing games often progress the plot based on other important decisions. For example, a player may make the decision to join a guild, thus triggering a progression in the storyline that is usually irreversible. New elements in the story may also be triggered by a mere arrival in an area, rather than completing a specific challenge. The plot is usually divided so that each game location is an opportunity to reveal a new chapter in the story. Pen and paper role-playing games typically involve a player called the Game Master, or GM for short, who can dynamically create the story, setting, and rules, and react to a player's choices. In role-playing video games, the computer performs the function of a game master. This offers the player a smaller set of possible actions, since computers can't engage in an imaginative acting comparable to a skilled human game master. In exchange, The typical role-playing video game may have storyline branches, user interfaces, and stylized cutscenes and gameplay to offer a more direct storytelling mechanism. Characterization of non-player characters in video games is often handled using a dialogue tree. Saying the right things to the right NPCs will elicit useful information for the player. It may even result in other rewards such as items or experience, as well as opening up possible storyline branches. Multiplayer online role-playing games can offer an exception to this contrast by allowing human interaction among multiple players, and in some cases enabling a player to perform the role of a game master. Exploration and quests. Exploring the world is an important aspect of many RPGs. Players will walk around, talk to NPCs, pick up objects, and avoid traps. Some games, such as NetHack, Diablo, and the Fate series, randomize the structure of individual levels, increasing the game's variety and replay value. Role-playing games where players complete quests by exploring randomly generated dungeons, and which include permadeath, are called roguelikes, named after the 1980 video game Rogue. The game's story is often mapped onto exploration, where each chapter of the story is mapped onto a different location. RPGs usually allow players to return to previously visited locations. Usually there's nothing left to do there, although some locations change throughout the story and offer the player new things to do in response. Players must acquire enough power to overcome a major challenge in order to progress to the next area, and this structure can be compared to the boss characters at the end of levels in action games. The player typically must complete a linear sequence of certain quests in order to reach the end of the game's story, although quests in some games such as Arcanum or Geneforge can limit or enable certain choices later in the game. Many RPGs also allow the players to seek out optional side quests and character interactions. Quests of this sort can be found by talking to a non-player character, and there may be no penalty for abandoning or ignoring these quests other than a missed opportunity or reward. Quests may involve defeating one or more enemies, rescuing NPCs, item fetch quests, or locational puzzles such as mysteriously locked doors. Items in inventory. Players can find loot, such as clothing, weapons, and armor, throughout the game world and collect it. Players can trade items for currency and better equipment. Trade takes place while interacting with certain friendly non-player characters, such as shopkeepers, and often use a specialized trading screen. Purchased items go into the player's inventory. Some games turn inventory management into a logistical challenge by limiting the size of the player's inventory, thus forcing the player to decide what they must carry at the time. This can be done by limiting the maximum weight that a player can carry, by employing a system of arranging items in a virtual space, or simply limiting the number of items players can hold. I've played with all of those, except for the weight one. The weight one I'm familiar with in Skyrim, but I've never actually fully played Skyrim. So that's fun. Character, actions, and abilities. Most of the actions in an RPG are performed indirectly, with the player selecting an action and the character performing it by their own accord. Success at that action depends on the character's numeric attributes. Role-playing video games often simulate dice rolling mechanics from non-electronic role-playing games to determine success or failure. As a character's attributes improve, their chances of succeeding at a particular action will increase. Many role-playing games allow players to play as an evil character. Although robbing and murdering indiscriminately may make it easier to get money, there are usually side quests in that other characters will become uncooperative or even hostile towards the player. Thus, these games allow the players to make moral choices, but force players to live with the consequences of their actions. Games often let the player control an entire party of characters. However, if winning is contingent upon the survival of a single character, then a character kind of becomes the player's avatar. An example of this would be Baldur's Gate, where if the character was created by the player dies, the game ends and a previous save needs to be loaded. Although some single-player role-playing games give the player an avatar that is predefined for the sake of telling a specific story. Many role-playing games make use of a character creation screen. This allows players to choose their character's sex, their race or species, and their character class. Although many of these traits are cosmetic in nature, there are functional aspects as well. Character classes will have different abilities and strengths. Common classes include fighters, spellcasters, thieves, and clerics, or a mixed class such as a fighter who can cast simple spells. Characters will also have a range of physical attributes such as dexterity and strength, which affect a player's performance in combat. Mental attributes such as intelligence may affect a player's ability to perform and learn spells, while social attributes such as charisma may affect players' choices while conversing with NPCs. These attribute systems often strongly resemble the Dungeons & Dragons rule sets. Here's a fun little thing. In Fallout 3, your intelligence level impacts your dialogue choices with characters. If you reduce your intelligence level down to as low as it can go, lots of characters just assume you are an incredibly stupid person and treat you as such. That's fun. Some role-playing games make use of magical powers or equivalents such as psychic powers or advanced technologies. These abilities are confined to specific characters such as mages, spellcasters, or magic users. In games where the player controls multiple characters, these magic users usually complement the physical strength of other classes. Magic can be used to attack, to defend, or to temporarily change an enemy or ally's attributes. While some games allow players to gradually consume a spell, as ammunition is consumed by a gun, most games offer players a finite amount of mana, which can be spent on any spell. Mana is restored by resting or by consuming potions. Characters can also gain other non-magical skills, which stay with the character as long as he lives. Yeah, I think that's about all we're going to be able to fit into this without going over a ton. So when we jump back in, we're going to be jumping into, looking at experience and levels. We're going to be looking at combat, interface, the history. We're going to be looking at the subgenres. And then we're going to actually dive into the subgenres. Like, for instance, we've got, ARPGs. We've got first-person party-based RPGs. We've got MMORPGs. We've got roguelikes and roguelike-likes. We've got sandbox. We've got tactical. We've got hybrid. We've got JRPGs. We've got Monster Tamer. We've got a lot going forward. So, yeah. A lot going forward, and we will pick up again with this next week. So, thank you everybody for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and until the next time, everybody, stay funky pepper.